When we think about the mechanics of movement, everything about the body is contralateral in nature. It's a trade off or a distribution of compression and tension throughout the body. And then everything has this reciprocating or rotational nature to it. So maybe the majority of our inputs on the strength and conditioning side should be reflective of that. If we just supplemented the term fascia for connective tissue, it wouldn't be such a contentious conversation because that's all it is. It's a global connective tissue. So now we are just trying to think about the ways that we can stress the body as it aligns to these primary myofascial lines, much or more so than looking at it as how do we get them to a 2.5, over body weight back squat? Because for me, that's a very, very small demand or part of the puzzle.
On today's MTB Performance Project, we have Danny Foley. Danny is the owner of Rude Rock Strength. He's also been doing a lot of stuff with Altis lately, running around the Pro Day circuit, Combine, NFL Combine. So glad you were able to make some time for us today, Danny.
No, man, I really appreciate you having me.
Yeah, it's I'm excited to have you on. I think I've consumed a lot of your stuff over the last couple of weeks and months. You're definitely like you have a very narrow skill set, and I think the way you approach your craft is certainly unique compared to most people in the S&C world, which is also very refreshing. I think there's a lot of people who could take a couple pages out of your book and really pursuing what they love, in a way that they enjoy it, right?
I've just been, I think the two things that I have really been grateful for have just been the environments that I've found myself in. Completely, had nothing to do with me or my ability. Starting with VHP, leading into now getting involved with Stu and Altis. This situation out here with Les in California. It's made things a lot easier for me. But then the second part of it is just the continued defiance, even to this point in my life, of just being very specific about what I do or don't want to do, and not having really any talent or anything behind it, but just leading with that, and just keep swinging at things until it clicks. So here we are, and I couldn't be more grateful or happier for where we're at right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I always love to see people in this world, strength and conditioning world, like do what they love in a capacity, because it can be a grind for a lot of people. I think they get into this profession because they love it, right? And they enjoy it. There's so many aspects that are very rewarding, but there's certain levels where, like, early on in your career, it's a grind, and it can be challenging. So I love the fact that you're able to do that on your terms. So um,
Well, we know, like, the term that gets thrown around for us all the time is burnout, right? And I think burnout is, like, heavily misconstrued as being just doing too much to the point of where it creates exhaustion. And if we kind of look at that from a little bit of a different lens, burnout is really where input doesn't match the output. So we're not being compensated enough for what we perceive to be doing, from an exertional standpoint or from a work effort standpoint. And the reality of our field is pretty grim, man. Like, I'm actually not sure how old you are, but being 34 now, I've kind of already seen half of the people, quarter of the people that were strength and conditioning coaches and doing this 10 years ago. A lot of them are real estate agents and firefighters now, and
yeah,
and so, of course, there's nothing wrong with that. But with the coaching industry, we're always in this predicament of trying to create our value and increase our dollarly value or hourly value rather, and then also at the same time still trying to retain our expression of what actually interests us or what our passions are. So I think there's a lot of unfortunate again, realities to our world where it's expected that we're going to work beyond 40 hours a week. It's expected that we're going to be okay taking a compromised salary, and then we're going to have to do all of these extraneous tasks that kind of expand beyond what we initially got into the field for. And for me, it was really trying to solve that problem, and I'm continuing to do so. I don't have all this shit figured out by any means, but to that end, I think with our space, I really have started to try to encourage, the younger crop of coaches to be, if nothing else, be presently aware of that as you go along. Throughout this young phase of your career, you want to try to see this as chess, not checkers, and set yourself up to where you're going to create some contingency opportunities for yourself. Work hard for somebody else, build somebody else's dream early on. It's what we all got to go through, but there is a very strong entrepreneurial opportunity in this field once we can see ourselves as being skill set people rather than just simple laborers.
Yeah, in that light, I mean, obviously, not to get too far into like your full story, because I think, how do you feel? Like, I think a lot of coaches, it's so contingent upon the situations they put themselves in, right? The people they're around, the places they work, whether there's opportunities. Talk to us a little bit about how like surrounding yourself in the right situation and the right people has allowed you to get to where you are right now.
So I've been away from VHP for about 3 years and some change now, but I swear it's just such a part of me, because it was such an impressionable era for me. I've told this story a couple of times, but effectively, when I first started at VHP, it was a regular performance gym. It was high school athletes, club athletes, whatever. Um, the guys who own the business were former Navy SEALs, but their transition plan was to, retire from the military side and then do this, performance thing. Well, literally one weekend, we got called in for a meeting. Hey, we've got an opportunity to do this program. So athletes are going to be out starting tomorrow. We got these military guys coming in. Here we go. It's the best way that it ever could have happened for me, because had it been designed for that tactical population when I initially had started, my thought process would have been to watch a bunch of Nat Geo things and a bunch of YouTube hype up videos and, basically try to assimilate the culture. And I never had the chance to do that, which was the perfect thing for me because it was a very authentic development. So to kind of answer your question here, I credit those people to this day for so much of this, and it wasn't even just from a professional development side of things, which that played a huge part. But I feel like I had a PhD level education of truthfully how to be a man and just how to be a good human and how to see what the true definition of sacrifice or hard work or pushing yourself really looked like. And these are the superheroes of our world, and I get to have these intimate conversations. So I really soaked up a lot of that, paid very close attention to that. It was a good fit for me from a character standpoint. And then on the professional side, again, when I first started with this, it was West Side Barbell, it was 531, it was reading all of Joe DeFranco's articles, and I love the element of strength and conditioning. But for me, when I got introduced to the injury side of things, it took it to a whole different level. The element of problem solving, the complexity that was involved, and also to just having to understand the body and the anatomy in a little bit of a different way, maybe perhaps even a little bit of a deeper manner. That was when I really saw this as being like, okay, this is definitely what I want to do for the rest of my life. And in the years since then, it started out with that military community, and now we've essentially just transposed that model into more of a conventional sports performance setting or realm. And it just, for me, it's a very meaningful task. And I think we can probably talk about this a little bit as we go through, but there's a lot of shortcomings to conventional return to play, and kind of the contemporary model for injury restoration. And I think that even though I missed out on a lot of the formal education of the rehabilitative side of things, the authenticity and the organic nature of the development from the strength and conditioning point of view to the injury side, I think has actually been, a really big advantage. So I'm very grateful for all of that.
Yeah, I think that's so you're clearly a product of your environment and at VHP in terms of, you think like your stereotypical conventional strength conditioning coach, and then based on the cases you were dealing with, you had to learn different ways of helping these clients and people out in ways that you weren't really accustomed to. And sounds like that's kind of what got you down the, the path of looking at things the way you do now. Maybe, from, I've heard you talk about how like the conventional strength and conditioning coach role is not really suited for you. Say a little bit more about that.
Well, so I'll preface this too by saying my wife has a background in Olympic weightlifting. I did some powerlifting for a while. Have spent some time in and out of sports performance chambers. So I mean this with absolutely no disrespect. That's my CYA. It just it, to me it was a little bit boring. And like if so one of the first places that I worked at in Texas was more like kind of high school youth athlete populations. And I remember putting something out on Twitter like, hey, working with youth athletes for the first time, give me your best advice. And I got 50 replies. And all of them were the same, right? It was like you're gonna
Yeah.
want to punch them in the face, and then they're a mess. They're so hard to kind of wrangle up, and then you're gonna put 5 or 6 inches on somebody's vertical jump, and then little Timmy's gonna come up with this smile, and it's just you're gonna get it. It's just gonna it's gonna register at that point. And it didn't. It didn't. Because the logical part of my mind was just kind of trapped in like, well, little Timmy's 15, so give me 6 weeks, some decent food, and we're gonna increase the vertical jump. So, to the point, I guess it didn't have, the same feel for me from a sentimental standpoint, but then also too from a work complexity standpoint where, it's nice to be able to automate things. And again, I'm not undermining anybody. And there's obviously a ton of people out there that are doing very sophisticated work on the strength side. But for me, comparatively, the injuries were definitely what kind of, juiced me up. So and I think too that the point that I've really tried to push, especially, recently in the last few months, is like we really do want to see these as being much more intertwined or integrated as opposed to being these completely separate chambers. One of my biggest philosophies is that when we have athletes that are injured, the last thing that we want to do is strip them from their environment, sequester them off into a different setting, have different music playing. It's a little bit dimmer, closed off. All you're doing in those cases is just reinforcing that they're damaged or broken and that they can't be a part of the team or a part of, what they're familiar to or want to be doing. So with that, we want to see these as kind of being in the same chamber with slightly different lanes or organizations. And we want to try to utilize from a methodological standpoint, we understand that we have to have load, velocity, and complexity in order to drive adaptation. So if we see the restorative aspect as being adverse to load and velocity, well, then we're kind of missing the point. So we're trying, and we're in the process of doing this right now, but we're trying to really build out more of a model or a system for how these two sides are truly integrated, and then being able to decipher or determine kind of where the athlete sits along this return to play process and keep them, a little bit more kind of biased towards the performance side as opposed to purely the therapeutic side.
I think that you touched on it. The psychological and social aspect is often really not spoken about. And we just think from physiological standpoint, like what are the things we need to do to keep this athlete moving? And we deal with a lot of athletes at my facility that are coming off of injuries, and we try to integrate them, through our physical therapists into our training, like, without any time wasted, right? Because there's, barring any major injuries, there's a lot of stuff athletes can do, outside of an injury, and I think that's an important part of the whole process that's often not talked about. And and it sounds like for you, like that's what, getting away from the conventional strength and conditioning, that's what fascinates you. And you feel like, hey, given my skill set, this is what I can do to provide the most amount of value to our athletes. Right. Um,
Yeah. The psychological side of it is really the foundation for everything to follow. And I think that from the environment to the perception to the language that's used, the setting, all of these different factors, they really kind of they cast the expectation for what the next however many weeks is going to include. And I've experienced kind of the disadvantages to both sides. If we're a strength and conditioning coach, then we're only really identified as lifting weights, running sprints, doing conditioning. So we can't, we can't help somebody who's had a knee problem. That's
Hmm.
just not true. And then alternatively, on the therapeutic side, and I've run into this problem more recently, when we introduce ourselves, or we're seen as being a manual therapist, or I'm not, but a physical therapist in sense, then we can't do anything that helps with performance. So I think that we have to be able to kind of create the psychological neutral to say, hey, this is all under the umbrella of performance. And there are three central factors that drive performance. We can either improve the skill, we can improve the foundation, the physical foundation to build those skills or to develop those skills, and then we can stay healthy. So between those three things, they're all under this same umbrella of performance. And just a matter of where the athlete is at that time, what they're trying to do, and then what our skill sets include. We are just trying to infuse our ability to affect or influence that performance acquisition.
Yeah, and that I think that's valuable for athletes to understand the nuance between all of them, and that they don't have to operate in silos. Uh,
Right.
some of the best strength coaches and physical therapists and everybody in between are the ones who can understand, you know, obviously what their quote unquote role is within that big picture, but also understanding like how you can blend, you're working together. And it sounds like that's something that, obviously in scenarios where maybe you're more on the therapeutic side, but still operating under, the guise of a strength coach. Whereas there's also probably going to be certain situations where you're going to be operating more as a strength coach, like as you said, as an athlete's healthy, right? You're just managing those symptoms if an athlete's going through like let's say in season model for an example, right? There's things day to day that like you're going to have to contend with, but at the end of the day, you're still going to have to train. You're still going to have to monitor load and volume and intensity, but now you just have a much greater toolbox and a larger bandwidth to help these athletes out, rather than saying, well, based on how you're feeling, I can't really help you. You got to go here. And it's like, well, like you said, getting back to feeling alienated in the social aspect of it, it can become challenging for athletes.
For sure, man. And full candor, like it can be challenging on this side of things too.
Yeah,
And initially for me, and I was very naive, but initially, like you just said, it's an expanded toolbox. So when I left VHP, moved down to Texas, and kind of just hit the ground running, doing this on a solo way, or in a solo way, I'm going down there and I'm like, yeah, I can work with athletes on the developmental side. I can do high school. I can do pro. I can do this, therapeutic aspect, and I can help people with injuries, gen pop athletes, doesn't matter. I can do it all. Well, the problem with that became, if you can do everything, you can do nothing, first and foremost. So there was no identity behind it. And then that created some internal turmoil where I didn't understand, well, when am I a therapist and when am I a strength coach? And do I have to? And it's ironic because when I'm looking outward, I'm saying, hey, we don't need to silo these things and we don't need to have everything be delineated. And then internally, I'm doing just that. So I'm like, well, when do I lead with the therapy hat? When do I lead with the strength hat? And this is an ongoing thing, but um, my real good buddy and now business partner, Chris Guerin, who's actually got somebody in the home gym right now. Him and I have linked up, and he was kind of coming from a similar space too, where he was identified as being the injury guy and being able to kind of solve problems, but then it relegated him from being able to be involved in more of the performance side. So again, it brings me back to the now where we are really trying to systemize and integrate this model where there's some tissue work, there's some load, there's some sprint mechanics, there's some stretching and mobility. And again, we go back to this umbrella of just what is needed to improve performance, what are those bricks, and then how do we organize these based on the athlete or circumstance that we have.
I love that because it's when you're working with athletes long enough, it is somewhat of a moving target, right? Their
Very much
their
so, yeah.
environment's always changing. Their where they are in their competitive year is always changing. Them as individuals, like from like just their body type, like it's like you're always trying to hit a moving target. So to have that ability to meet them where they're at is so imperative if you want to stay relevant. Getting back to
Right.
providing value, like And it seems like you've done a really good job of, one, matching your skill set with what your athletes need, but then also, the people that you've worked with and collaborated with, like, trying to find, like, hey, here's our best effort to give this athlete, or any athlete really, what they need from a developmental standpoint.
Absolutely, man, and it does work to my advantage from a business side because I do have the ability to offer different things. So bringing those two ends together, like the challenge at this point has become kind of the discretion of when do I try to lead with each, and then create the understanding beneath it that, like, hey, even if this is the primary thing that you need me for, just understand, I can kind of flex left or right. And I think that's kind of been like the entry point, for lack of better terms.
Got it. Got it. So let's say you're, somebody in strength and conditioning who kind of feels or thinks similar to the way you do it, but you kind of feel yourself in a situation where, like, I can only operate in this role. Like, what would you recommend to that person that's looking to gain more knowledge and expand their skill set, even though their situation might not allow them to do so?
The euphemism that I'd have for that is wide lens, narrow focus. Um, and it relates back to this, you know the panacea of performance, and in today's world especially, you know we've seen this expansion of subdisciplines, and people that have all of these different things that they do or specialize in. And what I have, kind of always tried to lead with is most people probably have something of value that they can provide. And then where most people probably go too far is they try to commercialize that one thing. So, like, not to pick on any one of these things, but we all have those in our minds where it's like that protocol or philosophy that you're selling your entire, business with probably has some merit or application,
Hmm.
but it's not the only thing.
Yeah.
So let's take the pieces of that are probably effective, put them in the toolbox, and then keep it moving. So the paradigm has to always be led or met with what is required for athletes to do what they do best, what is required to perform at the highest level. So speed and strength and mobility and recovery and tissue work, and then all of these other things. What I've tried to do is just be receptive to all of these different subdisciplines or divisions, collect the things that are relevant to my world or that make sense to me, and then just kind of continuously bundling or packaging them together to then be able to see with a wider focus. Or, again, like, it's just very self-limiting to start out as a strength and conditioning coach and say, I'm just going to help people get stronger and faster over the years. There's nothing wrong with that, but that's a segment of all of these other things that go into performance. So if nothing else, if your work even if you maintain just having this work application of banging weights and running sprints, you still want to know what the PT side looks like. You still want to know what speed and skill coaching looks like. You still want to know what sports psychology is doing. So having a good purview of all of these different elements will just make you a more effective practitioner or clinician in your work.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the more well-rounded you can become, it just makes you a little bit more versatile, and be able to, again, meeting your athletes where they're at and what they need at any given time. Not at an expert level, but at a level that you could speak to it. It's in some capacity. So,
Yeah, and I would say to this day, I have zero expertise. Zero. I thought I had some in the past, um, and then I just meet people that are true experts, and that's not me. Maybe one day, but
yeah,
I think that, for myself, it's like, yeah, there's a couple of things that I do pretty well. There's a couple of things that, are definitely just integral to my work in nature. But I'm definitely, much more of a master generalist than anything else. And I think that the again, like, the perception of like having a wide lens for the art of performance has kind of like reinforced that for me. And when you meet a true expert, you'll know right away,
yeah,
like,
yeah,
that's the Stu McMillan is an expert speed coach.
yeah,
I don't do anything in my life as well as he teaches.
yeah. Yeah, that becomes very apparent when you're around those individuals, you know,
100%. It's humbling.
it's almost like a good and a bad thing because, like, it's good because it drives you to constantly be better, right? And you're always the sum of the people you spend your time around, but then it also makes you realize how much you don't know, so
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And then the NFL Combine was another iteration of that for me.
yeah.
Because I've been, kind of leaning more on this therapy side over the last couple of years, and I've had some cool things and cool opportunities work wise, and done some decent stuff. But like being in that space, and then seeing how some of these other organizations, how their PTs, MTs, and all these other people are going about their work, I left the combine with extensive notes, several pages of notes, and it was humbling, but it was a really good thing for me to experience because there was a ton of opportunity for me to do better on that.
Well, speaking of being very well versed in something almost at an expert level, I think how originally got put onto your stuff was through fascial-based training and kind of jumping down that rabbit hole. And I know you've talked a lot about it and have interviewed a lot about it. Talk to us a little bit of how, like, the traditional, and our conventional mindset of strength conditioning, how it's somewhat limited in developing the fascial system.
I think the limitations kind of relate to everything we've been talking up until this point, where it's the perception of our work, it's the perception of what we do. And if we kind of trace back, the origins of strength and conditioning, like we're really only 60 or so years into this, right? It's still very much in its infancy as a professional industry. So I think we're still kind of playing in the sandbox, for lack of
Yeah.
better terms. But what did we do in the 1960s? Well, it was a college football game, Nebraska, Oklahoma, and Oklahoma beat the hell out of Nebraska. And Nebraska staff called this emergency meeting, like, well, what do we do? How do we not have this happen again? And it basically, led into Boyd Epley and the strength staff and them saying, well, Oklahoma was much bigger, much faster, and much stronger. So we need to do those three things. So then we looked at powerlifting, bodybuilding, Olympic weightlifting, and track and field. Those are the kind of main pieces to this thing. And we just kind of pick and pulled a couple of different things, pieced together, and said, hey, this is strength and conditioning. Although it was well intended, it was never directly devised from this point of view of how do we maximize human performance with the specific asterisk of in an individualized manner. It was born as a cookie cutter or just kind of base. Everybody has to squat, everybody has to bench, everybody has to run. I don't think that there's anything wrong with any of those things. Where I think we've been a little bit misled is just not having any ounce of interest in what else could be done supplemental to those things. So the number one constraint that we all face in public or private sector is the amount of time that we have with our athletes. It's always going to be our primary constraint. So even if you have a fortunate situation where you spend 5 or 6 7 hours a week with your athletes, that's still only 5 6 7 hours. So the way I've looked at it is okay, if I have this person 5 days a week for an hour, I have 5 hours. What can I put into that 5 hour window that will be the most saturated or enriching thing that I can provide for their opportunity to develop their skills better? Some of that includes squat, hinge, push, pull, lunge, whatever, whatever. Some of that includes some tissue work. Some of that includes some mobility and some movement concepts. And we go round and round. When we look at if we kind of isolate the strength piece on that, it's the same conversation. We all have to back squat with a barbell on our back. Why? Is there any other way that we're able to do this that is perhaps in some cases more applicable for the person at hand? Or is there just a more economical way that we can go about this in the sense of getting the adaptation that we're looking for without the damage that may occur, concurrently with that? So the recipe then becomes, and this is where the fascial piece comes into play. How do we observe the body and the movements, shapes, patterns, and signatures that are being expressed in sport? And the first thing that jumps out at me is we almost never, ever in any sport see an athlete in a bilateral stance with an evenly distributed neutral center of pressure between the feet. We also have compressive forces, but we see a lot more tensile and shearing forces than we do compressive forces. So, what is the purpose of the back squat then? If the purpose of the back squat is to create maximal CNS overload, pretty good option. Still other ways that we can do that, but pretty good option. If the purpose of the back squat is because we want to find the way that we can best load the lower body, I could make an argument for a few other things in lieu of the back squat. So then it just kind of leads me to the point again of like, well, what is the undying fidelity that we have to squats, deadlifts, cleans, and etc., all having to be a part of the recipe? When I was with DHP and working with the military athletes, it was abundantly clear right out of the gate. Bench, squat, dead in the conventional sense aren't going to be good options for most of them.
Yeah.
Most of them have degenerative discs. Most of them have had some kind of a shoulder surgery. Most of them have had some kind of a major lower body injury. We don't want to add compressive stress or force on top of compressive injuries. So, from that regard, we started to look at it as okay, what can we do that's the same effect, but a little bit safer, a little bit more, again, economical for them? Well, we're still going to load them, but we're just going to put them in a split stance. And then when we go for this peak, loading of the lower legs, well, we got a pit shark right there. It's a much lower skill. It's a much easier application, and we can load it objectively heavier than we can load a back squat because there's no skill adaptation required. So then we start looking at the mechanics of movement, and then this is where the fascial point comes into play. When we think about the mechanics of movement, everything about the body is contralateral in nature. It's a trade-off or a distribution of compression and tension throughout the body. And then everything has this reciprocating or rotational nature to it. So maybe the majority of our inputs on the strength and conditioning side should be reflective of that. If we just supplemented the term fascia for connective tissue, it wouldn't be such a contentious conversation because that's all it is. It's a global connective tissue. So now we are just trying to think about the ways that we can stress the body as it aligns to these primary myofascial lines as much or more so than looking at it as how do we get them to a 2.5, over body weight back squat? Because for me, that's a very, very small demand or part of the puzzle.
Man, that was really amazing because I think it's, I deal with so many rotational athletes and overhead throwing athletes. And, before I even researched fascia, like this is kind of a lot of the stuff that I felt like, yeah, there's points in an off season or in a training cycle or in a parts of an athlete's career. Yeah, we need to drive output. So what's what's the best option for that? I think often too many times strength and conditioning coaches are married to exercises and not movements. And at the end of the day, if if all we're driving or trying to drive is an output, there are so many other different options that are better suited for athletes. Much like you said, rather than a bilateral sagittal plane movement, put them in a split stance. You can
Yeah,
drive adaptation, and then for me, I so yeah, we've got that movement once their big lift for the day that's driving either force outputs or velocity power outputs, and then everything else is based on reinforcing reciprocal movement patterns. Especially somebody
100%.
who's sprinting, running, jumping, throwing, like it's all reciprocal movement. It's all based on gait cycle. It's like if you can understand the biomechanics there and drive adaptation there and consistency, like I think that's where a lot of strength and conditioning programs are missing for really like any athlete that relies on movement competency.
100%. The other interesting side of this too is like because we always love playing this cherry picking game of, we see DK Metcalf with a shirt off and then quote tweet it, lift the weights, and it's
Yeah.
like my man was going to look pretty much like he eats Sour
Yes.
Patch Kids and Reese's all day too. Like so, pick your battle here,
Yeah.
but it's interesting because if you go again, like you take football, you take basketball, you take any of these sports, we can cherry pick cases all the way through the years of athletes that did heavy load, 5-3-1 style powerlifting that went on to have great success, and then others that absolutely didn't. And then we have, like the Bo Jacksons and Herschel Walkers that only exclusively did body weight workouts. Muhammad Ali, in the back end of his career, moved to a remote mountain, chopped wood, like literally chopped wood, carried water, ate clean food, did push-ups and jumped rope and boxed.
Yeah.
So we can always be selective, and it's always going to lead back to our inherent biases, but we can always be selective in saying that because this athlete did it, every other athlete needs to do it. And it just isn't the case. There's so many different ways that we can create, positive or successful outcomes. So I think there's a lot more room for interpretation than we, tend to believe or we're led on to believe. And then again, like with, the force applications, we can't be just restricted or relegated to the compressive static load. There's got to be, more versatility in what we're doing.
Yeah, and I think this has become more apparent in my coaching, especially for athletes with like a very high training age. Would you agree? Where you know there's a certain period maybe in a young athlete's career where yes, very clear. Like I heard Stu talking to on a podcast saying like where most young kids want to get faster, like there's a high correlation to getting stronger and building force. But
100%.
the more sophisticated of an athlete you become, that's less of an issue. Like you fall under that strong enough category where now we need to start thinking of other ways of driving adaptation, and it's often pulling the small levers rather than like the big rocks. At that point you've already set the foundation, and so it seems like that's kind of where you can kind of go in with your like very prescriptive and very nuanced way of looking at things, essentially because you have the ability to do that and the bandwidth to do that, and now you can start to continue to build and uncover opportunities for performance.
Yeah, I had 2 things on that, like, it's the the fascial stuff for me was all completely unintentional, it just happened to occur that way, um, and I enjoy talking about it, so, I
Yeah.
continue to do so, but it is definitely misconstrued as, like, "Okay, well, then I must be an anti-force person." It's absolutely not the case, like, we load the shit out of the people we work with, we understand that for sure. So, it does not supplement or it does not negate the importance of just getting stronger, getting more hypertrophic, and understanding that there is a demand for these, conventional style movements or lifts. But the other side of it, and this again is another point that I learned early on working with the military side, is we were seeing consistently, and we had a lot of objective backing on this. We were seeing consistently that guys were getting stronger measurably with very little, direct intent of trying to do so. Muscle mass was going up, body fat was coming down, and then very importantly, the most consistent feedback point that we got was, "Man, I just feel better." Like, I just feel better. Like, previous like, specifically injured or not, I feel better was probably the most rewarding or refreshing thing that we could hear, because if we keep it in that context with that group, right, they're going out and doing really, really crazy things and really, really important things. So if we can have them finish and say, "Man, I feel stronger. I feel so much stronger," like, that's cool, but does that really move the needle for what we're trying to do? When you say, "Hey, I feel better," then I know from a psychological, physical, and physiological standpoint, you are in a better position to go do what you need to do right now because of this style of training, and that meant everything to us.
And it's probably comparable like an operator to a professional athlete, right? You
100%.
know,
Yeah.
them
Yeah.
them being able to walk out on the field and just feeling good is just puts them in a better state to compete. Um, but also it's just from an availability standpoint, that's from a professional athlete's point of view, I think arguably we would agree that that's the most important thing, right? If they're at that high level in professional sport, like they're clearly the one percenters or even more so. Like they physiologically, from an archetype, from their skill set, like they are high level achievers. if we can just keep them available as often as we can, like that's I think that's our job. And you can't stop injuries from happening, but you can keep athletes healthy, at least in the training standpoint. And that's kind of what we're talking about here.
Yeah, man, and, like, so the everything we just described right there, that's also how it works on a day-to-day manner as well, right? And so, so the role I played for Les for the combine was effectively, you know, the before session stuff and then the after session stuff, right? And they took care of the primary work. But even in my own individual work, the pre-session and post-session, what we're doing in the pre-session is we are trying to create a transient improved window to apply stress. So not to make more of it than it really is, but a warm up just isn't a warm up. Now we have a group of 20, 15-year-old kids, 16-year-old kids. Yeah, just do some dynamics, maybe hop on a foam roller, grab a band, and then let's go to work, right? So point taken there. But then when we get beyond that, it is a little bit more diagnostic in the sense that with the primary session, it is extremely important that we have load, velocity, and complexity in place. And if we have an athlete, we saw somebody yesterday, did an intake, wide receiver, NFL wide receiver, 30 years old. I think we had 12 injuries in the last 8 years, 12,
Yeah.
significant injuries, right?
Hmm.
So, how much do we need to do before the training session in order to create the most optimal window possible for these primary sessions? And so that creates this demand for a combination of some tissue work, some range work, some isolated activation, and then some total body integration. And if we have to extend that pre session to be 30, 35 minutes, but it saturates the next 20 to 25 minutes of primary loading, that to me is a much more effective strategy than just saying, hey, let's grab the band, jump on the foam roller. We got to make sure we get a full hour of lifting in.
Yeah. Yeah.
Performance,
Yes.
not strength. So what do we do to divide or ratio this time?
I love that. It's almost like you said, you're creating like a window of opportunity for that athlete to load, expose them to velocity, intensity. Now, maybe early on in the off season where you haven't had much bandwidth with that athlete, like you're spending more time with that stuff.
Right.
Although,
Yes.
as you're starting to affect and create adaptation and start to improve movement competency and motor control, like maybe you need to spend less and you can spend more time from a performance standpoint. But I think it always gets back to our original comment is like you have to meet the athlete where they're at. And it's not like a cookie cutter program where we're gonna squat and bench and do all these things and like that's our only way to drive performance. I think that's yeah, in a very narrow subset of athletes that would work, right? But then you're strictly limiting yourself for if you want to work with athletes for a long time, like that's it's not gonna fly.
And to recall another one of our previous comments, I felt great. Like I
Yeah.
felt great. And this was the feedback that we got yesterday was, I haven't felt like this in 9 months since I had this surgery. We did 20 minutes of work, 25 minutes of work. And we also, and just for clarification here too, we also always back it with this: I feel the best I've felt in X amount of time is transient. That's right now. If we do nothing else tonight, tomorrow, that thing's gonna ache a little bit again, right? So this is where being introduced to the therapy side of things in that world, they have been misled on some things too. Deep tissue massage in and of itself is not going to cure anything at all, right? Passive stretching is not going to cure anything at all. Those are effective tools and they're a part of the puzzle. But again, they go back to this potentiation concept where we're using this body work and we're using the range and we're using the isolated drills and activations for the sake of creating this window. So we take those things as potentiation concepts only for the sake of being able to do the main things a little bit better. And then if we do that with enough consistency over time, that will quote unquote fix the injury or the pain or problem that we had initially.
Do you find that through your experience, working with, let's kind of break it down in the football world because that's something that you've had experience with. So let's take a skill position versus like a lineman, right? Very different needs, very different archetypes, right? Um, However you want to characterize them, whether it's your kangaroos and your gorillas and or your narrows versus wides. Like, do you find that maybe the skill athletes more so inherently need that fascial driven type of training from an elasticity standpoint versus the linemen who inherently like they need to drive some level of like relative stiffness, right? So they need a lot more force production than the average skill position. Have you found in your experience that like from a competing demand standpoint one is more so than the other?
Yeah, it's a good question. Generally speaking, yes. I think the most uh, probably significant differentiation there with linemen, hips and low back, with receivers and skill, lower leg, foot. From a therapy standpoint, the primary focal point for most skill players is, like you said, they're highly elastic. Majority of them are predominantly elastic, so they really utilize stiffness in the Achilles or stiffness in the ankle to their ability or to their advantage. So we have to think about, from a therapeutic standpoint, the recurring breakdown that we're getting on the calf Achilles complex, for example, or on the plantar fascia. With the linemen, we're thinking more about, you know, subacute micro traumas, and we're thinking about, a lot of iteration of compressive forces. So that, from a therapy standpoint, is going to, indicate more of a decompression strategy and trying to kind of create space where it's being closed off. On the training side, I uh, I use the heuristic. Who was it? Oh, Andrew Paul gave this to me a couple years ago. Um, Performance director for the Thunder. Are we training in or are we training out? I thought that was a beautiful way of kind of classifying this. So if we are in a competitive window, we want to think about it as training in or reinforcing the skill or whatever their archetype is. When we are in an off season or a non-competitive window, that's when we want to think about training out or addressing the deficits of that athlete. So, for instance, with the combine time, we had, roughly 6 to 8 weeks with each athlete, and credit to Les here, he has an incredible, system or back end for how he measures, tests, and organizes athletes. So that was actually really helpful for me. But to that end, if we had an athlete who was elastic driven, force driven, whichever, um, we're not going to try to change that at all. We can't, because we're going to disrupt all of their mechanics. We're going to put them in a much more vulnerable position to incur an injury. So we're going to train in. We're going to lean into your strengths. If you're an elastic mover, we're going to keep that stiff ankle. We don't want to mobilize that. We want to make sure that the tissue breakdown is being monitored and managed, but we don't want to change anything. Once we get through this combine phase period and you run your great 40, and then now we get a little bit of a window to reset, that's when we want to go in and say, okay, hey man, like, you've got like 12 degrees of dorsiflexion on this right side. We should probably try to open that up a little bit and create a little bit more space. So that's kind of the broad separation of the two. From a training standpoint or from a strength standpoint, I think, again, to keep it kind of general here, with the linemen or the bigger athletes, you know, conditioning is always going to be a priority. The number one rule of NFL offseason is do not show up out of shape or overweight. So, that's always going to be the predominant focus. And then I think about it is like we want to preserve the strength foundation. We probably don't need to do a lot in terms of progressing that. If you can already bench 440, like, we're probably good on upper body strength. So then how do we express this strength in more ways? And this is where I go to movement bandwidth. So giving them a little bit more expression of the strength foundation that they've developed. With the skill athletes, it is going to be more of a slow build of trying to progress some of the foundational strength. And then it's kind of in that same lane of like, okay, now we've gotten the squat up, we've gotten the pulls up, or whatever it is. So now how do we do that fast? everything for those athletes, where everything is conditioning driven on the lineman side, on the skill side, everything's got to be fast. So I go to that, we always have the same rhetorical point here of, how strong is strong enough. But when we determine when we've reached that threshold, okay, boom, now let's maintain that. And now let's do things with modified foot position. Let's do things with different load placements. We'll change out the resistance type that's being used, start to break out into more planes of motion, different degrees of freedom. And then really just again looking at it all being underlined by that concept of velocity, moving very, very fast.
Yeah, and so if I'm hearing you correctly, and similar to my mindset with our professional athletes, because especially athletes who are their skill, their sport is executing movement at very high velocity. Whether you're a sprinter, on-field sprinting, team sport, field sport, um, you're a striking athlete like hitting and throwing, or those types of athletes, like their movements are executed at very high velocity. So there's a period in the off season where I want to take them away from that, right? Limit that exposure to high velocity. But then there's also a point where I'm ramping them up for their activities that they're going to see on the field. So it's almost like in season you're feeding their strengths and facilitating those weaknesses, keep them healthy. Whereas in the off season, you're doing the opposite, right? Finding those biggest limiting factors and say, hey, we have time to do this. We're far outside of competition. We don't need to be sprinting, throwing, hitting at high velocities. So we can take some time to build up this weakness. But then as we get you closer to season, you're shifting that back. Is that right?
Yeah, 100%. Yep.
Awesome. So let's say just real simply, like I'm a strength coach who's looking to integrate more fascial based stuff into my program. I've heard you talk about doing multi joint versus isolation, multiplanar versus single plane, and then force through the feet and hands. Talk a little bit about more of that stuff and how I can, outside of just the standard, force bias movements, and then how can I transition these things into in a program?
The way that I like to start this is like we all understand energy system distribution, aerobic and anaerobic, right? We know that these are dimmers, not switches.
Hmm.
So whether I'm doing a 10-mile run or I'm running a 40, all energy systems are going to be involved in that. There's just going to be a predominant focus for one side or the other. So now we come to this side of the conversation and we organize it as connective tissue versus contractile tissue. And no
Hmm.
differently that I can use specific parameters to bias aerobic versus anaerobic, I can do the same thing in the training setting that's going to bias more contractile structures or more so connective tissue structures. So with that being said, you absolutely cannot isolate fascia. It's not this completely different set of things. The euphemism that I use for this is we're essentially changing the perspective more so than the practice. We're changing the philosophy of training as much as we are the actual inputs or X's and O's. So it goes back to, some of the things we've already touched on, but the first thing that I'm looking at is the stance, position, and pressure that we're moving and loading from, right? So for me personally, I do very minimal bilateral loading, and if we have the perspective or the philosophy of thinking about the body as these five primary myofascial lines, well, then it's very evident right away why we wouldn't want to do too much from a bilateral sense because we're not putting full tension on the myofascial lines by being evenly distributed left to right. So almost everything I'm going to do is going to be in a split stance to include hang cleans, jerks, split snatch. Like I'm going to always catch in the split on those Olympic lifts. Same thing for accessories and all the other things. The next point is, and you mentioned it, but from foot to fingertip. So we we understand if I'm doing a dumbbell shoulder press, if I'm standing on 2 feet bilaterally, split my stance, do it from a half kneel position, do it from a tall kneel position, and then do it from a seated position like a Z press. Those are however many, 4 or 5 different exercises. It's a different aptitude, right?
Hmm.
If the legs are involved, it's more of a total body kind of kinetic movement. If I'm doing it from a half kneel position, it's much more of an isolated, pure overhead press pattern. So there's a time to zoom in and then zoom out. If I have, like I mentioned, this receiver is coming off of a shoulder injury. We have a shoulder injury. There's a deficit anatomically in that area, so we have to address that. So that's going to be a little bit more on the conventional side, a little bit more
Hmm.
isolated. but what we are working towards is reintegrating that injured area back to the body. So foot to fingertip becomes a concept there. Multiple planes of motion, multiple speeds, doing things with different types of resistance is another one that I think is very important. I go back to compressive versus tensile forces, and when we only use a barbell or a dumbbell, we're only kind of stressing the body from that side of the force conversation. So a lot of band work, a lot of cable work. I mean, there's 5 million different isokinetic tools now. They're great. So, I think it's a good application. Um, and then finally, we want to think about kind of the generally speaking, the proprioceptive demand to movement. The simpler term there is the variability or the complexity to movement, but sport is a microcosm of chaos, and there's a lot of dynamic to that. There's a lot of perceive and then position and then react or execute from that. So within reason, it doesn't become sports mimicry, but within reason, within the training setting, we want to kind of have that reflective as well. So different hand position, different foot position, changing where the load is, or changing the body position, and then the directionality of movement all become factors for that. But to summarize that, the element of the fascial component on this really speaks to the position, the speed, and then the type of load that's being used, and then really thinking about the perspective of the body and how we are arranged and how the body is structured, and then just thinking about the most conducive way that we can apply stress or load to the body from that lens.
Yeah, and it's almost, do you feel like this is a way of tying conventional training into like sport as a whole? Like you said, the chaos of the sport, almost like I know Anatoly Bondarchuk has like his exercise classifications, and at the top, right under his competitive event, he talks about specific developmental exercises. You know, that's kind of how I see a lot of this stuff. Not specifically, like, it's not exactly the sport itself, but kind of that link between conventional training and force application to, now starting to apply your new bandwidth of strength and power and whatever, and linking it into your sport.
Your strength, your measurable strength, is only as useful as its ability to be executed or displayed,
I
right?
love that.
And I go back to, like you mentioned, with the fighting community. So the Navy SEAL community, very similar in that regard. Body type, kind of lot of overlap between those two. Uh, I would bet anything on it that 9 out of 10 of those individuals I could outlift in a squat, in a clean, press, pick it. I'll outdo you on it. Every single one of them would put me in a pretzel in under a minute, right? So the execution or application of strength in that sense, back to that SAT point, if I can back squat 600 pounds, that's great. You are strong on a back squat. But then when we get into a fight, or we're at the line of scrimmage, or I'm going up for, a dunk on a fast break, how strong are you in that regard? So it's a different application, it's a different definition. And that's where, like with the Bondarchuk stuff, um, Franz Bosch is another one that I've looked into quite a bit over the years. It's trying to just align those two things, and then kind of seeing in the training space how we can account for the demands for pure force output and application, and then also the directionality, the velocity, and the complexity that are experienced in sport,
Yeah.
and how we kind of marry those two.
Yeah, it's almost, at the end of the day, we're dealing with athletes, so we're not trying to get them better in the weight room. We're our what we're doing is really just trying to get them better on the field. So it's got to it has to actualize on the field. So
Yeah, and transferability is a touchy subject. I know that there's a lot of different schools of thought on this, and again, I reiterate, that nothing that I've ever done or I'm ever trying to do is to recreate the sport per se in the training setting. It's not tying off a band to a baseball bat, or anything like
absolutely.
that. But there is this middle ground where like you don't have to be one of those people, and then you also don't have to be one of those, 5-3-1. If we increase the back squat, we increase the sprint. It's there's somewhere in between that we kind of got to figure out where it is.
This is super insightful, and I think you know I, this is something that as I've worked with athletes longer and longer, and I'm sure it's a lot of like what you're talking about today is you can't always take the same problem, same set of skill set to every single problem. Like you need to start to learn and adapt, and maybe that's why you love the capacity that you're working at. Is it really forces you to take each case as an individual case, and really it flexes your ability to kind of use your skill set. And and as you've been exposed to more stuff, you like you said at the combine, right? You were around people and situations where like you were forced to learn, and now you've probably come back and iterated what you're doing and figured out another way to do it. And I think that's just the evolution of a good strength coach.
I No, I appreciate it, man. And look, I've heard it over the years, and I absolutely understand. There's a school of people within our field that would listen to these types of conversations and go, Jesus, like that's why is he overcomplicate everything? And maybe they're right. I don't know. I do think that there is some level of simplicity that's involved in all of this, and at the end of the day, yeah, we work in pajamas in air controlled environments. Like it's, we're not, this is not trying to redefine gravity by any stretch of the means, but to that end, I do, I do take this very seriously. I think that it is a really important work application that we all have. Whether you do basic strength and conditioning with 13 to 15-year-olds, or you do, intensive clinical rehab. This is a very important field that is probably under recognized in the general sense. And so I'm really just kind of trying to push the needle forward in that capacity where, I really do want to figure out what these upper limits are. And like the muse that keeps me up at night is why do we continue to see such an astronomical rate of non-contact soft tissue injuries? In theory, these are things that aren't preventable entirely, but if we look at it from a probabilistic standpoint, we should see some reduction with all of the different tools and devices and all the open source information that we have now. And we haven't. So figuring that out, and then the other one is how far can the human body go? We see the LeBron James and Usain Bolts and Simone Biles of the world, and it's just such an incredible display of physical ability, and it makes you think like, well, where is it going to be in 50 years? Where is it going to be in 150 years? And what is the limit? We saw Michael Jordan jump from the free throw line in 1985, and thought that that defied being a human. And then now we have hundreds, if not more, people that are doing windmills in between the legs from the free throw line. So, where is that upper limit? And I think those are things that, we should all kind of, really marinate on and think about how we can have some influence on that.
Yeah, I mean, my next question was going to be like, given what you're doing day to day, what is exciting to you most? And sounds like really just challenging the status quo. It seems like based on what your answer was and previously that's kind of what your that's your north star, so to speak.
It is. And I'm definitely fully locked in on the injury side of things at this point in my career. And I do have a pretty intense passion for that, and I do want to figure out not just the overarching question of how do we minimize, this rate of soft tissue injuries, but then it also, looking at it as well right now. Well, actually, let's say 10, 15 years, well, 25 years ago, if you had an ACL injury, it was pretty much a career killer. 10 to 15 years ago, we saw, okay, you can come back from this, and it's going to take about a year to 18 months. And then now we're sitting in this position of like, if you're taking a year to get back from an ACL, like you're almost behind the curve now. So,
Yeah.
how
Yeah.
do we get that down? And is there a potential, day that we see an ACL injury being a 3 month to 5 month thing? I don't know.
Yeah.
I would like to figure out, if that is achievable. And then on the, again, with being in the entrepreneurial space, um, how far can I take this thing? And this started out as a side project, a little hobby that made couple $100 first year in 2018. Now it's a full-time thing, and we've got some cool stuff going on. So, between myself and my wife Nicole, and then Chris and a couple other people that we have involved in this thing, like let's see what we can do, and that's very exciting to me.
Well, as a fellow strength coach and entrepreneur, I appreciate all the stuff you're doing to push the industry standard forward. I think that's getting back to what you said earlier. Like that's what we need, right? Like we need to continue to have people who are critical thinkers and challenge the status quo of what good training is. And although yes, we can pull from the principles that have laid the groundwork, like there's always opportunities in anything to look at ways of doing it better. So, and it seems like
Yeah.
you're certainly in the forefront of that. So I appreciate it.
I'm also not good at anything else. I have no freaking clue what I would do if I didn't do this. So it was certainly a process of elimination for me. I knew I would never do anything else. So it makes it a little bit easier in that sense. But no, man, I just reinforce, what I said a moment ago, where like what we do is important. This is a significant thing. And I think for young coaches especially, like don't be misguided into thinking that this is something that's just superfluous or just an accessory to the outcome. We're very much instrumental to this, and take that part with a lot of pride and integrity. And if we can, really just fully immerse ourselves into this field or into this craft, there's a lot of things that can come out of it. It's a really really cool process.
I agree 100%. Well, Danny, really appreciate your time, brother. If people want to find more of what you're doing and follow along, where can they do that?
Um, yeah, so we're on Instagram. The Rude Rock page is at Rude Rock HP. I think mine is Dan Mode Rude Rock. YouTube channel, website, where we try to stay in vogue with all these things now. Um, but yes, and we're I've got a really really incredible opportunity with the Altis organization. So being a part of that master's program and being able to teach and provide for that has truly meant the world to me. So a lot of stuff coming up with them, and then on the ground out here in San Diego, have been extremely fortunate to link up with a lot of really really great people. We got some good things turning out here too.
That's awesome. Well, I'm happy for you. Appreciate you taking the time to chat today. I love first off meeting you in person, and hopefully we'll cross paths in some point down the road.
No doubt, man. Likewise, I really appreciate you having me, Mick.
All right, brother. Thank you.
Yes, sir.